This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. The Red Virgin. Rochefort Harbor, 1873. The journey from France to New Caledonia takes nearly 4 months by sea. A grueling passage around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and into the far reaches of the South Pacific. But for Louise Michel, exile was less a punishment than a release. She had spent the last 2 years shuttled from cell to cell, finally landing at Auberive, a Cistercian abbey turned state prison, where she had remained for 20 months. To Michel, the abbey was almost too perfect a metaphor. A house of God, now a house of the state. In those Gothic arches, she found a strange comfort, not in the cold or confinement, but in the women. Teachers, laundresses, nurses, radicals, gallant communards, all of them. Some familiar, others known only by their voices through the stone walls. What other place on earth, she often wondered, could gather so many brave women under one roof? Now they were being shipped off together in the hundreds, to a place they had never seen, where people toiled under empire's shadow, just as they had in France. Michel knew she might never again be free. And yet, on that August morning, as black sails unfurled above the glittering waters of Rochefort Harbor, she had to admit she was excited. The 4 months aboard the Virginie felt like a dream. The sea was the most beautiful of spectacles, Michel later wrote. She relished the voyage, even if she spent it locked in a cage. On her first night in New Caledonia, she gazed in wonder at the phosphorescent stars that made constellations in the waves. But as the desert air turned cold, she was suddenly back in Paris. It was March 18, 1871. Months of deprivation had left her emaciated, stinking, stripped bare of flesh. She was cold, always cold, but she was awake. She hardly slept in those days, and before dawn, she stood in the streets of Montmartre, among her neighbors beneath the gas lamps, waiting. A National Guardsman had warned her that the people's cannons, the cannons of Montmartre, paid for by subscription house by house, had been taken by Adolphe Thiers' men during the night. Michel gathered her neighbors to stop them from going further. And then a sound in the mist. Wooden wheels on cobblestone. Clop, clop, clop. Something heavy, dragged by men too weak to pull it cleanly. The street fell silent. All eyes turned. Then, out of the fog, came the cannons. These were the very cannons that had once defended Paris against the Prussians, now dragged away by hungry, weary soldiers, so poorly equipped they hadn't even brought horses. Michel felt a flicker of pity. These weren't monsters, just men following orders they likely didn't understand. Still, the theft was an insult too great to ignore, and the women of Montmartre would not let it pass. Michel was the first to step forward. She did not speak, did not shout. She walked, slowly, steadily, toward the line. And there she found herself face to face with an older conscript, his features worn, the look of a Paris worker who might have once stood under the red flag of '48. Now pressed into a gray uniform, he stood between her and the people's guns. Out of the corner of her eye, Michel saw her mother in the crowd. She must have followed, fearing this would be the day she lost her daughter. Michel didn't wave. She simply stared down the soldier as if disciplining a child. They would not shoot, not at women who looked like their mothers, their wives, their sisters. The officer barked an order. Fire! The soldiers did not move. He barked again. Still nothing. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, women stepped forward. Some climbed atop the cannon barrels, some stood in front. Others simply linked arms and blocked the path. They spoke to the soldiers, not with threats, but with chatter. And one by one, rifles rose butt first into the air. They would not fire on the people of Montmartre. As more and more soldiers broke ranks, the tension broke like a fever. Suddenly, the cold, smoky street became a carnival. People laughed, hugged, sang, drank. As Michel embraced her mother, she saw the remaining loyalists melt back into the fog, bayonets glinting red above their gray caps. They would return, but next time they would fire. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to ISM. This is Paris, 1871, the birth of the Commune. Throughout her life, Louise Michel would be called many things: the Red Angel, the Woman in Black, the Grand Dame of Anarchy, and by her comrades in Montmartre, simply Bonne Louise, Good Louise. But the name that would endure, the name history would remember, was the Red Virgin of Montmartre. Red for her revolutionary fire, virgin for her moral purity and unwavering idealism, Montmartre for the hillside district in Paris where she had lived and worked, and where, in 1871, she helped launch the most radical political experiment in modern European history to date. For the revolutionary left of the 19th century, the Paris Commune would become the defining symbol of their hopes and of their trauma. The moment when working people actually took power, when the streets of Paris pulsed with the dream of a new world. The Commune of 1871 became a myth even before the streets of Paris were drowned in blood and consumed by fire. Through the writings of Karl Marx, Mikhail Bakunin, and Louise Michel herself, it was transformed almost instantly into something greater than it actually had ever been. And in the years and decades that followed its tragic conclusion, the memory of the Commune would persist, inspiring activists and intellectuals, social movements and revolutions from London to Chicago, Barcelona to Moscow. Perhaps more than anything else, what captivated observers at the time and after was the Commune's potential. It lasted barely 2 months. Its leaders, many of whom were aging veterans of the failed uprising of 1848, had almost no time to put their radical dreams into practice, no time to build the social republic they had long envisioned. And for that very reason, the Commune became a blank canvas, onto which both its supporters and its enemies could project their deepest hopes and greatest fears. For workers and radical intellectuals, it embodied the promise of emancipation. For conservatives, a terrifying vision of chaos and anarchy. So today, we'll try to look behind the myth, to ask not just what the Commune symbolized, but what it actually was, and why, more than a century later, it still refuses to let go of our political imagination. Chapter 1. The City of Light. Be proud, Frenchmen. Lift your heads high, Frenchmen. You are no longer anything, and this man is everything. He holds in his hand your intelligence as a child holds a bird. Any day he pleases, he can strangle the genius of France. Victor Hugo, Napoleon le Petit. On the morning of December 2nd, 1851, Victor Hugo awoke to the sound of horses clattering over cobblestones. When he stepped into the streets, he saw walls plastered with posters. The National Assembly dissolved, universal suffrage restored, the first consul redeclared. Hugo understood instantly. Louis Napoleon had dropped the mask. He meant to make himself a king. He rushed through the cafes and workshops, warning whoever would listen that this meant the death of the Republic. But the weavers, printers, seamstresses only shrugged. The betrayals of 1848 had left the city exhausted. By afternoon, Victor Hugo was desperate. He and a handful of Republicans scraped together a few barricades, but it was a pale echo of past revolutions. Hugo watched helplessly as his friend Baudin was shot down, and as soldiers bayoneted unarmed crowds in the boulevards. Women and children lay dead in the gutters, slaughtered in the name of democracy. As a deputy of the now dissolved Assembly, Victor Hugo was a marked man. He moved from house to house, sheltered by friends, before finally slipping across the border into Belgium. It was the beginning of 18 years in exile. Like so many others who had fought on the barricades of 1848, Republicans, neo-Jacobins, and socialists, Hugo was forced into bitter exile, as his beloved republic was swallowed by the great general's nephew. In the weeks that followed his coup, Louis Napoleon and his followers dissolved the National Assembly and seized dictatorial powers. A new constitution granted him a 10-year presidency with sweeping executive authority. In direct response to these events, Karl Marx famously wrote that history repeats itself. first as tragedy, then as farce. The tragedy was 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte seized power at the close of the Revolution. The farce was his nephew, a, quote, unnatural product of capitalism, a man Marx mocked as a grotesque mediocrity playing a hero's part. Marx's words proved grimly prescient. On December 2, 1852, 50 years to the day after his uncle's coronation, Louis Napoleon crowned himself Napoleon III, the second emperor of the French. And so the revolution was buried once more, not by monarchs, but by a man claiming to inherit the revolution's legacy. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte rose on promises of order and grandeur, and so France was now an empire once more. And Paris, well, Paris became a stage. Under the Second Empire, the city would be transformed, physically, socially, and politically. Its medieval neighborhoods were torn down. Its narrow, winding streets were replaced by vast, straight boulevards. Behind this grand project stood Baron Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine. Haussmann was explicit about the true purpose of the project, admitting his intent openly. This was to be counter-revolutionary architecture. "We ripped open the belly of old Paris," Haussmann said, destroyed the neighborhoods of revolt and barricades, and cut a large opening through the almost impenetrable maze of alleys, piece by piece. Haussmann focused his demolitions on the working-class districts that had given birth to so many revolutions in 1789, 1830, 1832, and 1848. The empire intended to obliterate these uprisings from public memory. The working poor who inhabited these old revolutionary faubourgs, like Saint-Antoine, were pushed further to the margins, physically displaced by rising rents and literal demolition. Their communities were fractured, their proximity to the seats of power disrupted. Where once barricades could turn a street into a fortress, the new boulevards were wide enough for cannon fire and cavalry charges. And so, under the Second Empire, Paris gleamed. Its rail stations, sewers, gardens, and boulevards the envy of the world. The press called it La Ville Lumière, the city of light. But it was also a city of shadows, of mass arrest. Police informants, banned newspapers, and exiled radicals. As the boulevards became a stage and the empire a spectacle, the revolutionaries of 48 were transformed into hidden actors, waiting in the wings. Auguste Blanqui rotted in prison. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon published in isolation. Louis Blanc and Jean Derouen were exiled to London. The revolutionaries of 1848 had been scattered, and socialism began to feel like a long-forgotten dream. But even as the empire claimed stability, it never truly secured peace. Labor unrest simmered, underground cells reformed, and an entire generation of young radicals grew up not with barricades, but with the memory of them. Their parents remembered 1848. Their grandparents remembered 1832. Their city had changed, but its ghosts still wandered the boulevards. Then, in 1870, the emperor made a fatal mistake. Hoping to rally national pride and distract from domestic discontent, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia. By September, the gamble collapsed at the Battle of Sedan. The French army was routed, and Napoleon III himself was taken prisoner. The scale of the carnage at Sedan made it clear that Otto von Bismarck intended to do more than just defeat France. He sought to humiliate the French people and crush their national spirit. And for the Iron Chancellor, Paris, that great symbol of French power, was the ultimate prize. When news of the defeat reached the capital, crowds poured into the streets. On September the 4th, demonstrators stormed the Palais Bourbon, where deputies were still debating an imperial regency. But the crowd would have none of it. They surged through Paris alongside Republican deputies led by Léon Gambetta until they reached the Hôtel de Ville, the cradle of so many revolutions past. From its balcony, Gambetta declared that the Second Empire was no more. In its place, he proclaimed, in front of a jubilant crowd, the birth of the Third French Republic. But the heady euphoria of early September would not last. Within weeks, German forces would encircle Paris. Gambetta then formed a government of national defense and vowed to resist the Prussian advance to the bitter end. And so, the siege of Paris had begun. By the autumn of 1870, the capital was encircled, starving, and largely left for dead. But the people of Paris would endure. They would organize and they would remember. And in Montmartre and Belleville, where workers had been cordoned off far away from the gleaming boulevards of light, shared hardship began to forge a new spirit of solidarity and defiance. Chapter 2. Paris Encircled. Paris is the city of cities. There has been an Athens, there has been a Rome, and now there is a Paris. Is the 19th century to witness this frightful phenomenon? A nation fallen from polity to barbarism, abolishing the city of nations. Germans extinguishing Paris. Can you give this spectacle to the world? Victor Hugo, An Appeal to the Prussians, September 9th, 1870. Interlude. The Balloons. On the morning of September the 23rd, 1870, the air over Montmartre shimmered with hope. The siege of Paris was less than a week old. The hunger, despair, and bitter cold that would come to define it were still months away. For now, what people craved most was news. How many German troops encircled them? Was the rest of France organizing a relief? Could Paris still win this war? Would the National Guard take the fight to the enemy? Shortly after the city had been surrounded, Louise Michel had been arrested for the first time in her life. Not for treason or insurrection, not even for publishing radical pamphlets. She had been arrested for demanding to be sent to the front lines. She had gathered dozens of working-class volunteers in Montmartre and led a procession through the streets, chanting, to Strasbourg, a rallying cry for the first major city besieged by the Prussians, far to the east on the Rhine. It was a spontaneous outburst of patriotism from the working poor. The authorities responded by throwing Michel and her comrades into a holding cell. So on that bright September morning, the Red Virgin was not among the crowd gathering near the Solferino Tower atop the butte of Montmartre. The people had come not to riot, not to beg for bread, not even to protest. They had come to see the balloons. Almost as soon as the siege began, a balloonist named Eugène Godard began organizing what seemed at first like an impossible feat, finding a way to fly out of the city. Godard commandeered an abandoned train station and transformed it into a balloon workshop, where teams unrolled varnished cotton, sailors tied halyards, and baskets were woven from scratch. One of these balloons, the Neptune, was hauled up to Montmartre, chosen for its elevation above the city. As final preparations were made, the people of the butte gathered to watch. The crowd roared with applause as the pilot, a man named de Roff, climbed into the gondola. The balloon itself was an improvised machine, fragile, unpredictable, and prone to wild shifts in altitude. It could soar thousands of feet into the air and then plunge suddenly to ground level. But that morning, the Neptune lifted cleanly into the sky. 4 more balloons followed it. The crowd watched as they drifted upwards, shrinking into the clouds. For a fleeting moment, Paris felt connected to the world beyond the siege. Above the city, de Roff broke through the morning fog and into a scene of eerie clarity. From his perch in the sky, he saw the full scale of the German siege. Thousands upon thousands of enemy troops stretched across the horizon. Long lines of tents and trenches, cannon emplacements, and campfires. The earth below was scorched and lifeless. Burned-out villages lay in ruins between the city walls and the enemy lines, barricades and rubble marking a grim no-man's land. Yet no shots were fired. The German soldiers simply gawked at the strange sight of a balloon gliding silently above them. After 3 hours in the air, de Roff landed safely in Évreux, 100 kilometers northwest of Paris. On board, he carried nearly 300 pounds of military dispatches, letters, and communications, vital lifelines to the outside world. In the weeks that followed, dozens more balloons would rise from Paris, drifting over the Prussian lines. Together, they carried more than 2 million letters, a fragile but defiant network of communication. Each departure became a cherished ritual for Parisians starved of connection, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. One of the most celebrated ascents came on October the 7th with the balloon L'Armand Barbès, named for the radical Republican who had once fought on the barricades beside Auguste Blanqui. On that crisp autumn morning, hundreds crowded Place Saint-Pierre to watch. For this time, the gondola held not only male, but a national leader. Léon Gambetta, the fiery young deputy who had proclaimed the Republic only weeks earlier, now stepped into the wicker basket. He turned toward the expectant crowd, his tight teal bow tie stiff under a pointed, peppered beard. He spoke briefly, defiantly, and the spectators answered with rapturous applause. Then, as the ropes were cut and the balloon drifted upward, voices rose and necks craned. Some cheered, some wept, but all watched as their last hope of salvation floated unsteadily into the clouds. Léon Gambetta would successfully escape Paris, eventually making his way to Tours, where he began to rally forces out in the provinces. Crisscrossing the countryside by rail and carriage, he urged resistance, organized militias, and cobbled together a makeshift army. His goal was to lift the siege from without. Inside the city walls, Parisians poured their energy into defense and survival. In those early weeks, wild proposals flooded the provisional government, poisoning the Seine River, forming a corps of 15,000 women, Amazons of the Seine they were called, who would infiltrate German camps with pins dipped in prussic acid. None of these schemes were adopted, but their sheer audacity revealed a city grasping for any chance at salvation. The most enduring contribution came when the National Government of Defense commandeered Paris's factories and workshops, transforming them into wartime foundries. Day and night, workers forged rifles, cannonballs, and artillery. Some workshops turned out hundreds of thousands of cartridges per day. Nearly 500 cannons were cast in Paris alone. Many of those cannons were funded through popular subscriptions led by national figures like Victor Hugo, who had made his triumphal return from exile the day after Gambetta declared the Third Republic. The working poor, especially in neighborhoods like Montmartre, gave what little they had to arm their defense. In less than 6 months, these weapons would be turned on the workers who had built them, used by Adolphe Thiers to crush the Paris Commune. For these were the very cannons that Louise Michel and the women of Montmartre would later stand to protect. Yet, even these efforts could not turn the tide. Paris and Gambetta's armies could not coordinate across the blockade. The balloons flew out, but they rarely made it back in. Carrier pigeons were the only viable method of bringing messages back into the capital, with engineers in Tours using a microphotography unit to pack some 40,000 dispatches into a single tiny piece of parchment. These microscopic letters would then be projected by magic lanterns upon their arrival in Paris. But even though these birds became a symbol of hope and defiance, the majority of the pigeons did not complete their journey. So the city remained largely sealed. And as fall turned into winter, the siege took on a darker shape. Early patriotic hopes hardened into silence, frost, and slow starvation. Louise Michel was released from prison in late September 1870. Upon returning to Montmartre, she went straight back to organizing. But as the siege worsened and the chances of a French victory faded, her work began to take on a more radical edge. With Paris now fully cut off from the rest of France, the day-to-day operation of the city was largely taken over by volunteer organizations, the most prominent being the vigilance committees. Michel became a leading figure in the Montmartre Vigilance Committee, both the men's and the women's. She would later criticize the gender divide, writing, quote, "The two should be mingled because people didn't care about which sex they were before they did their duty. That stupid question was settled." The vigilance committees provided food, shelter, and essential aid to the urban poor, especially in the working-class faubourgs on the city's edges. They also cracked down on hoarding and profiteering. The 18th arrondissement was the terror of profiteers, Michel later recalled. When the reactionaries heard the phrase, "Montmartre is going to come down on you," they hid in their holes. We chased them down anyway, and like hunted beasts they fled, leaving behind the hiding places where provisions were rotting while Paris starved. This spirit of fierce solidarity fostered an environment in which radical communitarian politics flourished. To many, it felt as though the radical city was waking once more after the long repression of the Second Empire. Women were especially central to this resurgence, organizing in groups such as the Society for the Victims of War, the League of Women, the First Organization for the Rights of Women, and the vigilance committees themselves. Members of the International Workingmen's Association, the First International, were present too. They were never a mass movement in France, but their ideas of worker cooperatives, collective ownership, and secular solidarity blended into the ferment of the siege. As hunger deepened, the committees began to change. What had started as neighborhood relief groups, distributing food, caring for the poor, cracking down on profiteers, now grew into something more ambitious. They held nightly debates, passed resolutions, and coordinated with the National Guard. They began to look less like charity boards and more like embryonic councils. In place of temporary relief, they spoke now of a permanent social republic. The demands shifted from fair rations to a new way of organizing Paris itself. And so, within these neighborhood committees, we glimpse the beginnings of what would later coalesce into the Paris Commune by the spring of 1871. Their grassroots communitarian character and their relentless focus on the real material struggles of ordinary workers is what would set the Commune of 1871 apart from its predecessor in 1793. For while the leaders of Paris still looked back to the Jacobin Commune for its revolutionary zeal and patriotic defense, this second Commune would be something new, working class, socialist, and born directly out of the daily survival of the siege. But for some, survival was not enough. Like Victor Hugo, Auguste Blanqui would seize on the collapse of the empire as his moment of glorious return. At 65, Blanqui, nicknamed L'Enfermé, the imprisoned one, had spent more than 3 decades behind bars. Yet each time he was released, he returned immediately to his lifelong project, building a revolutionary vanguard to overthrow the state. Blanqui's tireless and clear-eyed commitment to insurrection at all costs attracted a devoted circle of followers, the Blanquistes, who shared their leader's revolutionary zeal. For them, every regime was provisional. As the government of national defense wavered, the Blanquistes, along with their allies in the National Guard and the vigilance committees, prepared to strike. In late October, a smattering of dispatches brought in by homing pigeons revealed that the fortress at Metz had surrendered to the Prussians. Rumors then spread that the government was preparing to capitulate and would soon hand Paris over to the enemy. Then, on October the 31st, Blanqui and his followers led a crowd of demonstrators to the Hôtel de Ville. Amongst the crowd was the aging neo-Jacobin and veteran of 1848, Charles de la Cluse, as well as the young firebrand, Gustave Florenz. Both men would emerge as leading communards in the months to come. This procession quickly turned insurrectionary as the group overran the Hôtel de Ville, declared a revolutionary committee, and called for democratic elections to a new Paris Commune. But the insurrection was premature. Poorly coordinated, lightly armed, and lacking mass support, it collapsed by nightfall. The government's forces retook the Hôtel de Ville with minimal resistance. Most of the insurrection's leaders escaped underground, but the government now marked radical figures like Blanqui, de la Cluse, and Florenz as public enemies. The failed uprising of October revealed growing fractures within the city. The government of national defense now clearly sought domestic order and was working towards a final peace with Prussia. But the people of Paris demanded a continuation of the war. And so it was within this atmosphere of deepening radicalism, cold, and hunger that Paris began to dream once more of building a social republic. Chapter 3. Dying of hunger, cold, and lead. For the people of Paris, the winter of 1870-71 meant above all hunger and cold. Cut off from the rest of France, food stores ran dry and coal for fires dwindled. The poorer districts, Montmartre, Belleville, the faubourgs, bore the worst of these deprivations. With markets empty and supplies exhausted, people turned to anything they could eat. First dogs, cats, and horses, then zoo animals, including the elephants Castor and Pollux, and finally rats. These grisly meals became symbols of the siege's desperation. But they were not evenly shared. The upper classes with money to spare dined on exotic meats in black market cafes. Restaurants served up cats, dogs, lions, tigers, even bear and leather. The poor, meanwhile, mostly just starved. The bourgeois diarist Edmond de Goncourt would write, quote, "The greater part of Paris is living on coffee, wine, and bread." By the end of the siege, tens of thousands would die from hunger or hunger-related illness. Then, on the night of January the 5th, 1871, Parisians awoke to yet another horror, the sound of cannon fire. For weeks, the Prussians would ceaselessly bombard Paris, not to annihilate them, but to force a surrender. Conscious of international opinion, they avoided large-scale civilian massacres. Instead, shells fell mostly at night, disrupting sleep, shaking buildings, sowing panic without full obliteration. The psychological toll was immense. Already starving and freezing, Parisians now endured deafening explosions and collapsing homes in the dark hours of winter. And yet, in Montmartre and Belleville, the effect was often the opposite of what the Prussians intended. Rather than break morale, the bombardment only deepened solidarity. Neighbors cared for each other. Radical circles tightened their bonds. Vigilance committees sprang into action. Shared hardship created shared resolve. By mid-January, the faubourgs were boiling with political energy. Hunger, cold, and rage had begun to forge a new kind of Parisian solidarity. Yet the grim resolve of the people stood in stark contrast to the faltering war effort of the government of national defense. Louise Michel had continued to plead with the ministers to arm the people, to let them fight. They answered by jailing her for a second time in December. At last, on January the 19th, the government finally relented. A desperate sortie was launched at Buzenval. Thousands of young guardsmen surged out of the city gates, their hopes pinned on breaking the siege. But within hours, they were cut down, scattered, or driven back. Hundreds died in the mud and snow. The defeat intensified the bitterness felt amongst Parisians, as rumors spread that the government was now sabotaging the war effort in order to hasten a surrender. And yet, the disaster at Buzenval was only half of the story, because just 20 kilometers outside of Paris, in the halls of Versailles, Otto von Bismarck prepared his final humiliation. Interlude: The Hall of Mirrors. On January the 18th, a long column of German troops paraded triumphantly into the Palace of Versailles. They moved with deliberate pride through the gilded corridors, beneath crystal chandeliers, beside golden busts, until they reached the Hall of Mirrors, Louis XIV's shrine to absolutism, a monument to France's old dominance over Europe. The soldiers struggled to contain their awe. Light burst in all directions from the hundreds of mirrors lining the walls. They looked up, mouths slightly agape, at murals of the Sun King defeating foreign foes, among them the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. Now it was their turn to occupy the space once built to glorify French power. Then an officer barked a command, and the troops snapped to attention. German banners unfurled in a wave of yellow and black. Wilhelm I, flanked by his Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and a procession of German princes, entered the hall and ascended a platform decked with imperial paraphernalia. A short Lutheran service followed. Then Bismarck stood and proclaimed the creation of a new political entity. A Grand Duke then stepped forward and said, "His Majesty, Kaiser Wilhelm." The cry rang out 3 times, echoing off the mirrored walls. "His Majesty, Kaiser Wilhelm. His Majesty, Kaiser Wilhelm." In the very heart of French monarchy, a German empire was born. Meanwhile, just 20 kilometers to the east, Paris starved and seethed. They had not endured months of hunger and bombardment for this humiliation. Within days, the city would erupt once more. Chapter 4: A France Divided. France bleeds, but liberty smiles. And in the presence of liberty's smile, France forgets her wound. Civil war? What does that mean? Is there a foreign war? Is not all war between men war between brothers? There is no such thing as a foreign or civil war. There is only just and unjust war. War does not become a disgrace. The sword does not become a disgrace, except when it is used for assassinating the right, progress, reason, civilization, truth. Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. Interlude. To assault the old world. Louise Michel looked up at the Hôtel de Ville. Dark silhouettes crouched in the windows, bayonets glinting in the winter light. She had expected indifference from the provisional government. She had not expected the Breton mobiles. In 1792, it had been the Swiss Guard who butchered Parisians. In 1848, the Guard mobile. Now it was the Breton mobiles who had been sent to play the role. Their muzzles hung like blades above the crowd. A chill ran through her. She stood in a long human chain, arms locked with comrades. To her left, the seamstress Sophie Poirier. To her right, the writer André Léaud. At the head of the crowd, she caught sight of Gustave Flourens, freshly freed from prison. The people had forced the government to release him the night before, just as they had for Michel weeks earlier. Paris would not let its tribunes rot in a cell. The people had come that day unarmed, or at least kept their weapons hidden. This was to be a peaceful demonstration, not an insurrection. They were patriots, not traitors. It was the government, not the people, who wished to surrender Paris to the Prussians. Out of the corner of her eye, Michel saw another woman in black. The same tunic, the same hair, the same build. For a strange instant, it was as if she had seen her double. Michel was brought back as La Marseillaise swelled, as hundreds of defiant, hungry voices sang as one. Then rifles cracked from the windows above. The crowd convulsed, scattering in panic. Michel, Poirier, and Léaud remained rooted in place, arms locked, willing the others to hold firm. But then the woman in black collapsed beside them, spilling blood onto the dirt below. Her young companion flung himself over her in grief, only to be cut down in the next volley, his body falling across hers. The chain broke as the three women rushed forward to help, but it was already too late. Then Michel caught sight of Flourens, charging past at the head of a column of National Guardsmen. "To the barricades," he cried. Michel looked up at the Hôtel de Ville and bared her teeth. "One day you will be on our side, you brigands," she shouted, fist raised. They could not hear her, yet she persisted. "One day you will bring to liberty the same conviction you now bring to the reaction." Sparks flashed from the windows. Bullets whizzed past. Michel stepped forward. "One day you will join us, and together we will assault the old world." As Parisians scattered into the frozen, smoking streets, it became clear that their city had changed. Hunger had made them desperate. Now bullets made them resolute. From this day forward, the Commune was no longer a dream. It felt like an inevitability. For many Parisians, the Breton mobiles' volley on January the 22nd was not an isolated act, but part of a long series of betrayals. It echoed the Champ de Mars in 1791, the June Rebellion of 1832, the June Days of 1848. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever the people rose, the government answered with bullets. Louise Michel later wrote of that day, quote, "No shot was fired by the people before the Breton mobiles fired their volleys. Yes, you fired on us. You killed us, but you believed you were doing your duty. Someday we will convert you to our ideals of liberty." So those shots did more than scatter a demonstration. They severed the fragile tethers that still bound Paris to the provisional government. Nowhere was this rupture more apparent than in the National Guard. By February, the Guard had swollen to more than 300,000 men. Once a bourgeois militia, it had become a citizen army rooted in the working-class faubourgs of Montmartre and Belleville. Early on in the siege, the government of national defense allowed guardsmen to elect their own officers in hopes of boosting morale. But democratization had a radicalizing effect, as many officers came from vigilance committees and socialist clubs. Months of siege, hunger, and betrayal then bound the Guard to their neighborhoods. forging bonds of solidarity between local battalions and the people of Paris. And so by winter of 1871, the Guard had become increasingly untethered from the government. The January the 22nd uprising then simply confirmed what many already suspected, that the government meant to capitulate and was indifferent to Parisian suffering. In the aftermath, Guard delegates tightened their coordination through a central committee that was loose and improvised but increasingly effective. Then, on January the 28th, the suspicions of Parisians were confirmed when the government signed an armistice with the Prussians. The deal had three major consequences. First, the bombardment stopped and food trickled back into the markets. Second, the forts surrounding Paris were surrendered and the army disarmed. But crucially, the National Guard was left exempt. Government negotiators knew that to disarm the Guard at this point would immediately spark an insurrection, and so the People's Army kept their weapons. Finally, the armistice also called for new elections to a National Assembly. But when the results came in, Paris was stunned. The assembly was dominated by conservative monarchists, mostly from the countryside, men who saw the capital's workers as dangerous and depraved. Adolphe Thiers, the butcher of June 1848, was named chief executive. As a final insult, the assembly would not even sit in Paris, but eventually in Versailles, the palace of the Ancien Regime, symbol of monarchy and despotism, untouched since before the French Revolution. From the moment it took power, the new assembly under Thiers moved to stamp out the radical energy building in Paris. On February the 22nd, they ordered the vigilance committees dissolved and reimposed press censorship. Rumors then spread that the Guard itself was going to be disarmed. So, on February the 24th, working-class battalions and radical clubs marched once more on the Hôtel de Ville. But this time they were openly armed. But just as in October and January, this insurrection faltered. Outside the eastern arrondissement, Paris did not yet rise, and by nightfall the revolt collapsed. Still, for radicals, February the 24th marked a major turning point. The National Guard, once a pillar of bourgeois order, now clearly stood with the people of Paris. By the end of February, France had split into two irreconcilable camps. On one side stood the working people of Paris and their allies in cities like Lyon and Marseille, hardened by hunger and emboldened by the radicalized Guard. On the other stood Versailles, the so-called Party of Order, guardians of property, industry, aristocracy, and the rural vote. As Paris seethed and Versailles prepared to accept a humiliating peace, all eyes now turned to the new chief executive, the man Karl Marx that year would call, quote, that monstrous gnome, the consummate expression of bourgeois class corruption, beloved in the provinces, despised in Paris, Adolphe Thiers. Interlude, Monsieur Thiers. The Palace of Versailles stank of foreign occupation. Boots clattered on marble floors where courtiers once glided in silk. German sentries leaned their rifles against Louis XIV's gilded door frames. Prussian flags draped from the rafters like trophies. Adolphe Thiers paused in the corridor, his small frame stiff with disgust. He had loved Versailles as a boy, a shrine to the grandeur of France. Now it was a barracks for the enemy. Down the hall came Otto von Bismarck, heavy-jawed and broad-shouldered, his mustache bristling above a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The two men shook hands. Thiers forced a polite bow, though his stomach churned. He wanted to tear the banners down, to rage at this usurper, but he swallowed it. He had only one task now, to end the war, whatever the cost. The days that followed were a slow humiliation. At 74, Thiers was already exhausted by months of frantic diplomacy. London, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Florence, each city offering him nothing but false hope. Now, under Bismarck's glare, his efforts collapsed into ruin. The terms laid before him were brutal. France must cede Alsace and Lorraine and pay an indemnity so vast it would cripple the nation for years. At one meeting, Thiers reportedly broke down in tears. Bismarck, hardly a sentimental man, allegedly offered a strange consolation, half mockery, half embrace.
"Ah, my poor Monsieur Thiers, there is no one but you and I who really love France." And as if this were not enough, Bismarck then demanded a German victory parade through Paris itself. When Thiers returned to the new National Assembly with the treaty in hand, his voice faltered, nearly breaking down once more. Deputies from Paris, like Victor Hugo and the socialist Louis Blanc, rose in fury, demanding renewed resistance. But the countryside delegates, conservative monarchists to the core, voted overwhelmingly for peace. And so, as the German army vacated Versailles, the French assembly moved in, taking their place among the ghosts of kings and cardinals. From these gilded halls, Adolphe Thiers prepared to restore order to France, whatever the cost, while the Prussian army readied its triumphant march through Paris. Chapter 5. Paris Awakes. On the morning of March 1st, 1871, Paris fell silent. The German army had prepared for loud, jeering insults or possibly even armed resistance, but instead they were met with shuttered cafes, black mourning flags, and empty boulevards. The sound of 30,000 boots on cobblestone echoed through a city that had seemingly gone mute. As they marched, soldiers stared in amazement at the bare tree stumps lining the Champs-Élysées, once shaded by elms and chestnuts, now cut down for firewood during the brutal siege. Others took note of the Arc de Triomphe, half buried in sandbags to protect it from shell fire. A few drifted toward the Louvre, only to be pelted with copper coins by hidden Parisians, a bitter down payment on the enormous war indemnity they would now soon owe. That afternoon, the Germans staged a victory parade at Place de la Concorde, horns and drums echoing through the western arrondissement. But by the next morning, they were gone. The occupation had lasted less than a day, and it seemed that the months of hunger, defeat, and humiliation were now over. In the days that followed, Paris turned its attention to food. After months of starvation, supplies poured into the city. Bakeries reopened, wine reappeared, people feasted. But the joy was short-lived. Once the first hunger was sated, the bitter reality returned. The suffering, the cold, the rats, it had all been for nothing. The new government under Adolphe Thiers had surrendered. Paris had not been defeated by Prussia, but left out to dry by Versailles. Reminders of the siege remained everywhere. Bombed-out buildings, shuttered shops, the stumps of the city's trees. For the working-class guardsmen of Paris, the armistice brought no peace, only idleness, unemployment, and rage. Outwardly, the city was calm, and some mistook this quiet for submission. But Adolphe Thiers, who had overseen the suppression of revolts in 1830, 32, and 48, knew better. Paris had not forgiven, Paris had not forgotten. And so Thiers would strike first. On March the 17th, the government received word that Auguste Blanqui, the most feared revolutionary in France, was hiding in the south. At age 66, Blanqui remained a symbol of insurrection, sharp, tireless, and dangerous. Thiers ordered his arrest. Troops loyal to Versailles broke into the home of a sympathetic physician where the revolutionary was hiding and took Blanqui into custody. He would be transferred again and again, moved constantly to prevent rescue. He would spend the entire life of the Commune in chains. And the very next morning, Paris would rise without him. Interlude: The Cannons of Montmartre. Jacques Bonhomme had not signed up for this. The private stared at the row of monstrous cannons in front of him and saw no way to drag them down the butte of Montmartre. They all knew how important it was to take the artillery quietly. Monsieur Thiers had drilled it into their heads all evening. Then General Lecomte had repeated the order ad nauseum as they climbed the hill. But they had already come upon one guardsman, and there was no way that they could make it out undetected. No horses, no carts, just ropes and cold hands. Who had planned this? Jacques glanced toward the general. Lecomte's eyes were set and steely, but his lips betrayed a quiver of fear. To Jacques' right, another private gave a tired huff, shrugged, and stepped forward to start tying the ropes. First around the cannon, then around his own chest, like a draft mule. By the time they reached the streets below, they had lost any hope of surprise. The men strained against the weight, hauling the cannons over cobblestones, the ropes cutting into their shoulders. Then, over the din of boots and wheels came a new sound, the ringing of tocsin bells. Montmartre was awake. Turning a corner, Jacques stopped in his tracks. A line of women stood across the street, arms locked, silent. A wall of aprons, skirts, and petticoats advancing steadily through the dawn fog. Lecomte shouted, "Hold!" The men obeyed. "Clear the street. We don't want trouble." No response. "I said, out of the way!" Silence. Then one woman stepped forward, draped in black save for a single red scarf, hanging like a banner from her shoulders. Her face was stoic, her eyes locked ahead. From somewhere in the crowd came a murmur. "Bonne Louise." "Halt!" shouted Lecomte. She kept walking. "You, woman, halt!" She continued. Lecomte's voice rose in panic. "Ready your guns!" Jacques froze. Was he serious? Fire on a woman for simply walking toward them? Then he watched as his arms moved without his consent. Rifle up, finger twitching at the trigger. He stared down the barrel, which he found was now aimed at the red scarf on the woman's chest. His hands shook, but they no longer felt like his own. A hot tear filled the corner of his left eye. "Fire!" Lecomte screamed, but no shots came. "Fire, I said!" Silence. Jacques blinked in astonishment. His left arm was dropping, his right raising the rifle's butt into the air. His fingers were already twisting the barrel down toward the ground. And he was not alone. The soldiers all around him did the same. And then she stepped through the line. Bonne Louise, her scarf brushing the barrels now lowered to the ground. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Jacques thought he saw the faintest smile curl at her lips, as if she had always known the rifles would not fire. Then the crowd surged forward. Skirts and aprons swarmed the cannons. Guardsmen cheered as one of them with a red armband had General Lecomte face down on the street, hands being tied. The people of Montmartre had taken the cannons. News that the cannons of the National Guard had been seized by the people of Montmartre spread like wildfire through the surrounding faubourgs. Like a house of cards, Versailles' grip on Paris collapsed swiftly and completely. General Lecomte and General Clement Thomas, the officers charged with reclaiming the guns, were captured by guardsmen and mutinous soldiers. That evening, an improvised tribunal condemned them. They were beaten with rifle butts and shot down. The civil war in France had begun. With their generals now gone, discipline in the Versailles army disintegrated. Soldiers either fled or, just as often, fraternized with the crowd, swept up in the wave of euphoria that surged through the city. By the afternoon of March the 18th, Parisians were pouring into the Marais across the arrondissement, a strange mix of jubilation, confusion, and tension in the air. Street bells rang, flags unfurled from windows, strangers embraced, and songs rose from barricaded corners. Yet beneath the celebration, a quiet, collective breath was being held. No one quite knew where this moment would lead, though more and more voices could be heard shouting, "Vive la Commune." In Montmartre, Mayor Georges Clemenceau conferred with the leaders of the National Guard. A radical Republican and friend of Louise Michel, he grasped the volatility of the moment. "We are caught between two bands of madmen," he later wrote, "those in Versailles and those at the Hôtel de Ville." That day he urged restraint and forbade further extrajudicial killings, a warning that foreshadowed the tightrope he would walk in the weeks ahead. Meanwhile, Adolphe Thiers watched events with alarm. The veteran politician, witness to and suppressor of countless revolutions, knew better than anyone how quickly the winds could shift. Realizing that the attempt to seize the cannons had failed miserably, he ordered a retreat. Gathering ministers, officers, and bureaucrats, he fled Paris for Versailles. Amid the celebrations and confusion, the government departed virtually unopposed. They would immediately begin plotting how to retake the city. With Thiers gone, a power vacuum opened. The Central Committee of the National Guard, though wary of its own legitimacy, stepped in. Its leaders were hesitant to claim authority outright, knowing they had no mandate from the people. Yet some sort of order was needed. The committee began issuing decrees, occupying key buildings, and trying to maintain the fragile peace. The following morning, March the 19th, guardsmen traveled down to the Hôtel de Ville, expecting resistance. To their amazement, the building was completely abandoned. They walked in and almost sheepishly took possession of the seat of government. Just like that, Paris was now in the hands of its people. For the next week, the committee acted as a provisional authority, wary, improvisational, deeply democratic. Its leaders refused to declare themselves a government, calling instead for citywide elections. As bank clerk Francois Jourde later recalled, quote, "We did not know what to do. We did not want to take possession of the Hôtel de Ville. We wanted to build barricades. We were very embarrassed by our authority." Even so, the committee quickly issued a series of social decrees aimed at easing the burdens of everyday working Parisians. The most significant was a ban on evictions for tenants unable to pay their rents, a measure born from desperation. The Versailles government had announced that all rents were now due in full, despite the months-long moratorium enforced during the siege, and many workers now faced the threat of sudden homelessness. The committee acted to forbid these evictions. It also prohibited the sale of items that had been pawned during the siege, allowing families to reclaim their belongings. In the neighborhoods of Belleville, Montmartre, and the Latin Quarter, a buzz of excitement filled the air. Street meetings bubbled with urgency, clubs debated into the night, and workers patched together barricades while always finding moments to sing. After months of hunger and cold, the radical city was finding its voice once more. On March the 26th, Parisians went to the polls. The election of the Commune drew a coalition of radicals, artists, socialist artisans, and ordinary working men and women. And though he sat in a prison cell, Auguste Blanqui was declared honorary president of the Commune in absentia. 2 days later, on March the 28th, the elected delegates entered the Hôtel de Ville to a wave of cheering crowds. A flag was hoisted above the building. Not the tricolor of the Republic, but the red flag of socialism. And so, what had begun as a desperate stand on the butte of Montmartre became a declaration of solidarity, a hopeful claim for a more just and equal world. As the delegates took their seats, they were greeted by an ocean of red, scarves, belts, cockades, flags, and shouts of Vive la Commune. The silence of the siege had been broken. Paris, starved and betrayed, was once more the city of revolution.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps des séries, où l'on s'en vêtu, qu'ils m'ont répondu pendant du Cerise d'Hermont, et rose appareil, tout bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps de série.
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.